300 Spartans held a mountain pass against 100,000 men, not because they were stronger, but because they picked the ground. Tactics have decided more wars than weapons ever have. And some of the deadliest ones ever used weren't about killing more people. They were about tricking the enemy into destroying themselves. For as long as humans have fought each other, the side with the better plan has usually beaten the side with the bigger army. From the deserts of ancient Persia to the frozen forests of the Eastern Front, from jungle ambushes in Vietnam to drone strikes in the 21st century, war has always been a game of brains before brawn. This video breaks down the tactics that shaped history, the ones that won empires, the ones that ended them, and the ones so brutal they changed the rules of war forever. Before there were armies, there were ambushes. It's the single oldest tactic in human conflict, older than metal weapons, older than written history. The idea is brutally simple. Let the enemy walk into a place where you have every advantage and they have none. In 9 AD, 3 Roman legions, nearly 20,000 men, the best trained soldiers on earth, marched into the Teutoburg forest in modern Germany. Their commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, trusted a local ally named Arminius. Arminius was actually a Germanic chieftain who had been raised as a hostage in Rome, trained in Roman tactics, and then turned against them. He led the legions into a narrow forest corridor, hemmed in by hills on one side and a swamp on the other. Then his warriors attacked from the trees. The battle lasted 3 days. Roman formations, built for open-field fighting, couldn't function in dense woodland. By the end, all 3 legions were annihilated. Rome was so shaken that Emperor Augustus reportedly banged his head against a door, shouting Quintili ver, legions red. Varus, give me back my legions. Rome never again tried to conquer Germania. One ambush redrew the borders of an empire for 400 years. The core principle hasn't changed since. Choose terrain the enemy can't fight well in. Remove their ability to retreat. Strike before they know they're in danger. From Teutoburg forest to Viet Cong jungle traps in the 1960s, the ambush works because it turns an army's greatest strength, numbers, into a liability. But the ambush was just the beginning. Some tactics didn't just kill soldiers, they were designed to break their minds. Fear spreads faster than any army can march. Commanders throughout history figured out that if you could terrify an enemy before the fighting even started, you'd already half won the battle. The Mongols under Genghis Khan turned this into a science. Before laying siege to a city, Mongol commanders would offer terms. Surrender, and you live. Resist, and every person inside dies. They weren't bluffing. Cities like Nishapur in modern-day Iran, which resisted in 1221, were reportedly leveled so completely that Mongol forces allegedly had the skulls of men, women, and children stacked into separate pyramids as a warning to the next city down the road. Word of these massacres traveled ahead of the Mongol army faster than the army itself could move. By the time Mongol forces reached the next city, many simply opened their gates without a fight. Historians estimate the Mongol conquests killed tens of millions of people, and a horrifying percentage of that toll came not from battle, but from cities that fought back after hearing what happened to the ones that didn't. Psychological tactics didn't disappear with the Middle Ages, they got more sophisticated. During World War II, Nazi Germany's Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers were fitted with wind-powered sirens called Jericho trumpets. As the planes dove toward their targets, the sirens produced a shrieking wail specifically engineered to trigger primal fear in anyone on the ground. The bombs themselves weren't even the point. The sound was. And once you understand psychological warfare, the next tactic makes a disturbing kind of sense. Sometimes the goal isn't to win the battle. It's to make sure the enemy never wants to fight you again. Scorched earth is one of the cruelest tactics in the history of warfare because it targets civilians as much as soldiers. The strategy: if you're retreating, burn every field, poison every well, and destroy every building so the advancing enemy finds nothing but ash. Russia perfected this against invaders twice, roughly 130 years apart. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte marched over 600,000 men into Russia, expecting a quick, decisive war. Instead, Russian forces retreated for months, burning crops, torching towns, including much of Moscow itself after Napoleon captured it, and leaving nothing behind for the French army to eat. Napoleon's Grande Army began to starve deep in enemy territory, hundreds of miles from any supply line. When the brutal Russian winter arrived, the retreat turned into a catastrophe. Historians estimate fewer than 100,000 of the original 600,000 soldiers made it back. Napoleon's empire never recovered. Stalin used the same tactic against Hitler in 1941, ordering Soviet forces to destroy anything of value as they retreated, factories, railways, grain stores, rather than let it fall into German hands. Combined with the same brutal winter that broke Napoleon, it helped grind the Nazi invasion to a halt outside Moscow. Scorched earth wins wars. But the cost is almost always paid by ordinary people who starve in the wreckage long after the armies have moved on. Quick recap. So far we've covered the ambush, psychological terror, and scorched earth, tactics built on fear and denial. Next, the tactics get faster and far more mechanized. Many introduced a tactic that shattered every assumption about how fast a war could be won. Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war. The idea combined three things that had never been properly synchronized before: fast-moving tank divisions, close air support from dive bombers, and mobile infantry following behind in trucks. Instead of a slow, grinding front line, German panzer divisions would punch a narrow hole through the weakest point in enemy defenses, then race deep into enemy territory before the defenders could regroup or even understand what was happening. Stuka dive bombers, the same ones with the screaming sirens, would hit communication lines and supply routes ahead of the tanks, throwing the entire enemy command structure into chaos. Poland fell in 5 weeks in September 1939. France, protected by the supposedly impenetrable Maginot Line, fell in 6 weeks in May and June of 1940. The German army simply went around it through the Ardennes forest, terrain French commanders considered impassable for tanks. It wasn't. Blitzkrieg worked because it attacked something armies hadn't defended before: time itself. By the time an enemy commander could get accurate information about where German forces actually were, those forces were already somewhere else. Speed could win a battle in weeks. But some of history's darkest tactics weren't about speed at all. They were about grinding an enemy down over years, whatever the human cost. Long before tanks, there were walls. And for almost as long as there have been walls, armies have figured out that starvation is often more effective than any weapon. The Siege of Leningrad, which began in September 1941 and lasted 872 days, stands as one of the deadliest sieges in human history. German and Finnish forces encircled the Soviet city, cutting off nearly all food and fuel supplies to a population of over 3 million people. As winter set in, daily bread rations for civilians dropped to as little as 125 grams, roughly the size of a deck of cards, often made partly from sawdust and cellulose to stretch what little flour remained. People burned furniture and books for heat. Reports from the siege describe residents eating boiled leather, wallpaper paste made with edible starch, and household pets. Historians estimate that between 1 and 1.5 million people died during the siege, the overwhelming majority from starvation and cold rather than combat. What makes siege warfare so effective and so horrifying is that it doesn't require winning a single battle. It simply requires patience and a wall the enemy can't get past. The defenders' greatest strength, their fortifications, becomes the very thing that traps them. We've now covered 5 tactics built around terrain: fear, denial, speed, and starvation. From here, the tactics get more deceptive, because sometimes the deadliest move isn't force at all. It's making the enemy believe something that isn't true. Some of history's most decisive military victories were won without a single bullet fired in anger. They were won through lies so convincing the enemy planned around a battle that would never happen. Operation Fortitude, run by the Allies in the lead-up to D-Day in June 1944, remains one of the most successful deception campaigns ever executed. British and American intelligence built an entire fake army, the first United States Army Group, complete with inflatable rubber tanks, fake radio traffic, and a real, decorated commander, General George Patton, placed in charge of a force that didn't exist. The goal was to convince Hitler that the main Allied invasion would land at Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, rather than the actual target, Normandy. It worked. Even after Allied troops were fighting on the beaches of Normandy, Hitler kept an entire panzer army group at Calais for nearly 7 weeks, waiting for an invasion that never came, convinced the Normandy landings were a diversion. That single act of deception may have saved tens of thousands of Allied lives and helped secure the beachhead that ultimately led to the liberation of Western Europe. But deception isn't just about fooling generals with fake armies. Sometimes, it means turning the enemy's own weapons against them. Guerrilla warfare flips the entire logic of conventional battle. Instead of meeting a stronger enemy head-on, guerrilla fighters use small, mobile units, hit-and-run attacks, and intimate knowledge of local terrain to slowly bleed a larger force until it can no longer sustain the fight, militarily, financially, or politically. The Viet Cong's tactics against American forces in Vietnam through the 1960s and early 1970s are one of the most studied examples in modern military history. Rather than fighting the technologically superior U.S. military in open battle, Viet Cong fighters built extensive tunnel networks. The Siu Kai tunnels alone stretched over 120 miles, allowing fighters to appear, strike, and vanish underground before American forces could respond. Booby traps, camouflaged pits with sharpened bamboo stakes, and ambushes in dense jungle turned every patrol into a potential death trap, forcing American soldiers to fight an enemy they often couldn't even see. The tactic didn't need to defeat the U.S. military outright. It needed to make the war too costly, too long, and too politically unpopular back home to continue. By 1973, American combat troops withdrew from Vietnam, not because they lost every battle. By most measures, the U.S. won the vast majority of direct engagements, but because the tactic had achieved something more important than battlefield victory, it exhausted the will to keep fighting. Guerrilla tactics proved that a smaller force could outlast a superior one. But what happens when a nation doesn't just want to outlast the enemy? It wants to trap them completely. Encirclement, sometimes called a pincer movement, is one of the oldest and most devastating tactics in military history. Surround the enemy completely, cut off their supply lines and retreat routes, and force them to either surrender or be destroyed. The textbook example happened over 2,200 years ago. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, the Carthaginian general Hannibal faced a Roman army nearly twice the size of his own, roughly 86,000 Roman soldiers against around 50,000 of his own troops. Instead of matching Rome's strength in the center, Hannibal deliberately let his center line buckle backward as the Romans pushed forward, drawing the entire Roman army deeper into a crescent-shaped trap. Meanwhile, his stronger flanks and cavalry swept around both sides of the Roman formation and closed in from the rear. The Romans found themselves completely surrounded, packed so tightly together that many couldn't even raise their weapons to fight back. What followed was one of the single bloodiest days in ancient warfare. Historical estimates suggest Rome lost somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 soldiers in a single day, a casualty rate that, by some comparisons, exceeds the losses of entire multi-day battles in later wars. Cannae became so infamous as a tactical masterpiece that military academies still teach it today, more than 2,000 years later, as the gold standard for how to annihilate a numerically superior force. We've covered tactics of terrain, fear, deception, and encirclement, but everything so far has still followed some version of a rules of engagement. The next tactics abandon that idea completely. Total war is the tactic that removes any distinction between combatants and civilians, treating an entire nation's population, infrastructure, and industry as legitimate military targets. During World War II, area bombing campaigns targeted entire cities rather than specific military installations, on the theory that destroying a population's ability to work, sleep, and function would cripple the enemy's capacity to keep fighting. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 remains one of the most controversial examples. Over 2 nights, British and American bombers dropped roughly 3,900 tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs on the city. The resulting firestorm generated winds so intense they reportedly uprooted trees and sucked people into the flames. Death toll estimates for Dresden vary widely among historians, ranging from around 25,000 to, in some earlier and now largely discredited estimates, well over 100,000, but even conservative modern figures place it among the deadliest single bombing campaigns of the war against any city. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 was arguably even more devastating. In a single night, American B-29 bombers dropped incendiary bombs designed specifically to ignite the wood and paper construction common in Japanese cities. The resulting firestorm is estimated to have killed more people in a single night than any other bombing raid in history, including, by some estimates, more immediate deaths than either atomic bombing later that year. Roughly 16 square miles of the city were destroyed. Total War tactics won wars faster by targeting the systems that sustained an army, factories, railways, and the workforce that ran them. But they did it by making no meaningful distinction between a soldier and the family living 3 streets from a factory. And if Total War blurred the line between soldier and civilian, the next tactic erased any pretense of morality entirely. Chemical warfare represents one of the most feared and, eventually, most restricted categories of tactics in military history, precisely because it's nearly impossible to control once deployed. World War I saw the first large-scale use of chemical weapons on the battlefield. At the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, German forces released roughly 168 tons of chlorine gas across a 4-mile front against French and Algerian colonial troops. Soldiers who had no gas masks and no understanding of what was happening watched a yellow-green cloud drift toward their trenches. Chlorine gas attacks the respiratory system, causing victims to essentially drown in the fluid produced by their own damaged lungs. Thousands of soldiers died within minutes. Thousands more suffered permanent lung damage. Chemical warfare escalated throughout the war. Mustard gas, introduced later, caused horrific blistering of skin and lungs and could linger in the soil and contaminate an area for days or weeks after an attack, making captured ground nearly uninhabitable. By the end of World War I, chemical weapons had caused an estimated 1.3 million casualties across all sides, a toll horrific enough that most of the world's nations signed the 1925 Geneva Protocol, banning the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. The ban didn't stop every use. Reports of chemical weapon use have persisted in later conflicts, and the sheer horror of gas warfare, an enemy you cannot see, cannot outrun, and cannot fight back against, cemented it as one of the few tactics considered so inhumane that even nations willing to firebomb entire cities agreed, on paper at least, to leave it behind. From gas that drifted with the wind to bombs that erased entire cities, war's tactics kept escalating in scale. But the next tactic isn't about scale at all. It's about a single person willing to die to guarantee a hit. By 1944, Japan faced a battlefield reality it couldn't ignore. American naval and air power had grown so overwhelming that conventional attacks were failing to inflict meaningful damage before Japanese pilots were shot down. The response was one of the most extreme tactical decisions in modern military history, the kamikaze program, in which pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft directly into Allied ships. The tactic was based on a grim calculation. A heavily damaged aircraft that couldn't return home anyway could still guarantee a hit if the pilot simply steered it into a target. Between October 1944 and the end of the war in August 1945, an estimated 3,800 kamikaze pilots died carrying out these attacks. They managed to sink or damage several hundred Allied ships, killing an estimated 4,900 Allied sailors, a toll significant enough that some American commanders described kamikaze attacks as the most psychologically terrifying tactic they faced in the Pacific, precisely because there was no way to negotiate with, deter, or intimidate a pilot who had already accepted death as the mission's outcome. Suicide tactics weren't unique to the Pacific theater or to the 20th century. Either variations of the concept, from self-sacrificing rearguards to modern suicide bombings in later conflicts, have appeared throughout military history whenever a smaller or more desperate force needed to guarantee damage against a target it otherwise couldn't reach. What makes the tactic so uniquely disturbing isn't just the loss of life. It's that it removes the last assumption underpinning most military strategy, that a combatant, given the choice, wants to survive. But not every devastating tactic in history required a single dramatic moment. Some of the deadliest strategies ever devised didn't even involve fighting the enemy's soldiers at all. A naval blockade doesn't need to sink a single enemy ship to be devastating. It simply needs to control the water, cutting off food, fuel, and supplies until the nation on the other side of that water begins to break from the inside. Britain's naval blockade of Germany during World War I is one of history's most effective, and most overlooked, tactics. From 1914 onward, the Royal Navy systematically intercepted merchant shipping bound for Germany, cutting off imports of food, fertilizer, and raw materials. Because Germany had become heavily dependent on imported nitrates for both fertilizer and explosives, the blockade created a brutal double bind. Producing enough explosives to keep fighting meant less material for fertilizer, which meant crop yields collapsed. By the winter of 1916 to 1917, remembered in Germany as the turnip winter, food shortages had become severe enough that ordinary Germans were surviving largely on turnips, a crop normally used for animal feed, after potato harvests failed and grain reserves were exhausted. Historians estimate the blockade contributed to several 100,000 excess civilian deaths from malnutrition and related illness during the war, and, controversially, the blockade was actually maintained for several months after the armistice in November 1918, as a pressure tactic during peace negotiations, worsening the death toll even after the fighting had officially stopped. The blockade never fired a shot at a German city. It didn't need to. It simply waited on the water while starvation did the work. Every tactic in this video, from the ambush in Teutoburg Forest to the firebombing of Tokyo, was built on the same basic assumption. That war, however brutal, was still survivable for the winning side. That assumption ended on August 6, 1945. At 8:15 that morning, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released a single bomb over Hiroshima, Japan. Unlike every tactic before it, which required thousands of soldiers, hundreds of aircraft, or months of siege, this required one plane and one weapon to erase an entire city in a single instant. The blast killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people immediately. By the end of that year, radiation sickness, burns, and related injuries had pushed the death toll to an estimated 140,000. 3 days later, a second bomb struck Nagasaki, killing an estimated 40,000 people instantly, with the toll climbing to around 70,000 by year's end. What makes this the true endpoint of every tactic covered in this video isn't just the death toll. Total war bombing campaigns like Tokyo's firebombing had already killed comparable numbers in a single night. It's what came after. For the first time in the history of organized warfare, humanity built a weapon that made the entire concept of victory potentially indistinguishable from mutual annihilation. Every tactic before the atomic bomb was, in some way, about outsmarting or outlasting an enemy while your own side survived to see the outcome. The nuclear age introduced the terrifying possibility that a war fought at that scale might not leave anyone left to call themselves the winner. Every tactic in this video shares one uncomfortable truth. War has never been won by force alone. It's been won by whoever understood human psychology, terrain, and desperation better than the enemy did. From a forest ambush 2,000 years ago to a single bomb that changed warfare forever, the story of military tactics is really the story of how far people are willing to go to make sure they're the ones who walk away. If the kamikaze program's grim calculation stuck with you, you're going to want to watch our deep dive on every Special Forces unit explained next. Some of these same psychological tactics show up there in ways you wouldn't expect. Which tactic in this video shocked you the most? Comment below and let us know. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We break down one dark chapter of military history like this every single week.